Hello everyone, my name is Jeff Ferris. Welcome to my shop. If you're a Woodpeckers fan, you probably recognize the shop because we do a lot of the videos for Woodpeckers Tools here. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. Instead of showing you about Woodpeckers Tools, I'm going to use my tools to build something. And what we're going to do today is we're going to build a picture frame. I'm going to show you how to make the molding, how to cut the miters, and how to cut a spline for the joints. And then we'll also take a look at putting the matting, glass, and backing into the frame. What are we framing today? Well, these are a couple of prints from a book. A few years ago, I watched a series on Netflix, I think, one of the subscription services. It's called Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. And it's about the science of cooking. It's a really enjoyable show and a fantastic book as well. I enjoyed the book so much that I bought a copy for John Hine, the guy that does the video work for us at Woodpeckers. And he liked the book a lot, and he bought me these two prints. And so I'm going to frame those, and Nancy wants them in the kitchen. So we're going to get those put together. I'm going to show you exactly every step of the way that we took to get these framed and ready to hang. Let's get started. The prints that I'm framing have a lot of bright orange in them. Just a couple of weeks ago, I finished a pair of Paduke coffee tables for our family room. I have a little bit left over, and the color is going to be just perfect for these frames. I cut a bunch of my scraps up to 18-inch lengths with my miter saw. One thing you'll notice in this and some of my upcoming videos is that I have a passion for older woodworking equipment. My jointer is a 1950 Craftsman. I have plans for a cosmetic restoration, but for now, it's cutting perfectly. After I bought it a couple of months ago, I sharpened the blades, reset them, and aligned the tables. It cuts dead flat and leaves a beautiful finish. Another one of my machinery restoration projects is this 1940s vintage Craftsman hand-fed 6-inch thickness planer. It works just the same as a modern thickness planer, just without feed rollers. There are pressure bars forcing the stock down onto the table, and you provide the locomotion. I have two other thickness planers, but this one fit this job perfectly because it doesn't snipe at all, and I can control the surface finish by just feeding slowly. The newest piece of equipment in my shop is my new SawStop table saw. I love the power, performance, and safety of this saw. The centerpiece of my shop is a Kitty K5, a small 5-function combination machine built in France from the 1960s through 1995, when European safety regulations outlawed tilting table saws and easily accessible drive belts. I sold these machines in the late 80s and early 90s, and saved this one for myself when they were no longer available. The spindle shaper on it may be my favorite feature. It is so much smoother, quieter, and more efficient than a router table. I sawed the rabbet out with 2 cuts on the table saw, because Paduke can splinter when rabbeting with a router or a shaper. Let's do a little picture frame math. So the material beyond the rabbet, I'm going to round that up to 15/16. Okay? So, since we're on a 45-degree angle, the rise equals the run. I don't have to worry about changing anything. 15/16 is the amount that it's going to grow in the miter. So, I need that on both sides. All right, so that's 30/16, which is 1 14/16, which is 1 7/8. Okay, that's how much longer my outside dimension needs to be to achieve the inside dimension that I want, which is 11 inches plus 1 7/8 is 12 7/8. And then the other side is 14 plus 1 7/8 is 15 7/8. The miter gauge on my old K5 is brilliant. It's a perfect square. So you cut one miter on the back and then the second on the front. Do that for all four sides of the frame, and the four corners always come out perfectly, even if the gauge isn't quite dead on 45. The angles are always complementary. The stops are nice and crisp too. Even after 30 years of use, they still make sure that the pieces are all exactly the same length. I glued the frames together and clamped them with a simple framing clamp that uses a nylon cord. If you need a lot of clamping pressure to pull a miter joint together, you did something wrong somewhere along the way. These simple little framing clamps are just perfect for pre-gluing when you're going to put a spline in. So last night I got my frames glued together and I left them in the clamps overnight. Taking this one out, everything looks pretty good. So we're ready to sand it and put some finish on, right? Not quite. It's not that simple. Let's talk about wood technology for a minute. A lot of you folks probably already know what I'm going to go over, but let's go over it for the folks that are new to this. Wood is funny when you use glue with it. If I take these two pieces and I butt them edge to edge like this with a little bit of glue on those two surfaces, put them in clamps and let the glue dry, the joint between the two pieces of wood is actually stronger than the wood. If you break it, you'll break it close to the glue line, but not on the glue line. The wood will fail before the glue line fails. That's true if it's like this, or if it's like this, or if it's like this, or if it's like this. Anytime you have the face of the board and the edge of the board in contact with each other, the glue line is going to be just fine. What you can't do is this. You can't glue the end grain fibers to end grain fibers. And you can't glue end grain fibers to face grain fibers. Well, what about a miter? Now, a miter is a little bit different animal because we're not dead end grain. We're kind of half and half. That miter joint isn't end grain, but it also isn't long grain. So what about gluing a miter like this? Well, you can see that it's holding together. That joint is temporarily okay. It needs reinforcement. And one of the really good ways to reinforce that is to cut a slot right there and put a spline in there. Okay, and that's what we're going to do on these, is put a spline inside that miter joint. And we're going to do that with a saddle jig on the table saw. And that's what we're going to make next. So what's a saddle jig? Well, a saddle jig is a device that rides over top of your rib fence and allows you to do different kinds of things with your saw blade. Basically, you need a board that's the same width as your rib fence, and then a couple more to go along with that. So that creates the saddle, and it'll ride on the fence like this. Now, some days it just pays to be lucky When I decided to do this morning, I went to my scrap pile to try and find some stock to mill down to be the same size as my fence, and that piece came out of the scrap pile at exactly the right size. In fact, I don't think I could make it any better. It's just ever so slightly thicker than my rib fence, so it's perfect. I got a couple of pieces of plywood that I'm going to add to that, and then we'll add some fences. We'll get this thing ready to make some spline cuts. So the clever way to put this together is just do it right where you're going to be using it. So I'm going to make a line here. Don't want any glue below that point. And I'm just going to take some plain old woodworking glue. Doesn't need a lot. This isn't a joinery project, it's just a jig. Okay, I don't want to have to wait for clamps on this, so I'm going to take some CA. I'm going to put a little bit there, a little bit there. We're going to reinforce the woodworking glue with CA. I'm going to take the piece that's going to go against that, hit that with a little accelerator. Now, activator on one piece, glue on the other. Be careful bringing them together. Join it up, hold it together. And the miracle of CA is evident. It just bonds everything together right now. So let's do that again. Wood glue for longevity, CA for speed. They're a great combination. All right, there's the saddle jig. All we need to do now is add our support beams that'll hold it at 45. So I'm going to take a combination square and I'm going to put that on the edge and make it intersect with my center line just above the edge of the table. Now I'm going to flip it over, and I want to go to exactly the same point. Exactly the same point in the other direction. Now that perfect 90 degrees intersects right on my center line. I'm going to double check it and make sure that we're right where we want to be with a triangle. So my first plan was to do this the same way I built the saddle, which, me using a combination of wood glue and cyanoacrylate. But I'm a little nervous about doing that because this needs to be right on that line, and it could come off very easily. So I'm going to use, instead of using CA that could get me in trouble, I'm going to use just yellow glue, clamps, and a couple staples. Okay, right on my line, just off the table. Come in here. Pop a staple in it. Right now we'll do that on the other side. appears to be relatively straight. I'm on the pencil line. Okay, so we're all ready to go here. I had some scrap stock and I made a test cut. We got the depth right. We're just under 1 inch for the depth of our spline. And I'm using a 3/16 wide flat bottom kerf blade that I've had for many, many years. I use it for grooving all the time. That 3/16 is a nice wide kerf. That makes it a little bit easier to prepare the spline stock. And let's get going. So the 3/16 groove was the absolute limit of my little lunchbox Makita planer, but we got there just where we wanted to be. Nice slip fit. Another one of my machinery restoration projects is this 1963 DeWalt radial arm saw. Most of my woodworking career, I've heard how dangerous and inaccurate radial arm saws are. Well, I'm becoming a convert. Cutting this spline stock to just 1.5 inches isn't something I'd want to do on a table saw. I buttered up the spline stock with Type Bond 2. Slipped the splines into the slots. Gushed it around a little bit to make sure we had it spread right. And then put a small F-clamp across the joint for good measure. After the glue on the splines had dried, I trimmed the excess with the radial arm saw. I put a straight piece of scrap behind the frame to make up for the little stubs of the splines that were sticking out. This was another job that was ideally suited to the radial arm saw. You have your cut line so you can line it up perfectly. I did the final cleanup of the splines with a block plane. Then I combined hand and power sanding to get the frames ready for finish. I rubbed on 2 coats of Osmo Pollux oil. I am a big fan of anything that is wipe on and wipe off. After the Pollux oil dried, I used the 3-step Beal buffing system to buff the frames to a high sheen. Framing the picture started with carefully attaching the print to the mat with acid-free double-face tape. Then I cleaned the glass and put it in the frame. Followed by the mat and the print, and then a piece of plain white mat board. I came very close to messing up the whole project by not measuring the combined thickness of all the material before I made the molding. I just barely had enough rabbet depth. I used glazer's points to hold everything in place. If I had it to do over, I would have made the rabbet deeper and made some sort of wooden retainer. Glazer's points are made for much softer wood than Padauk. I did manage to get them all in without catastrophe. Well, I got the pictures hung and I think they look great. A couple of things that I'd like to point out to you. I put them on the wall with command strips. That way you can't bump them out of line. And when you get ready to take them down or move them, there's no damage at all to the wall. I really love those things. You'll also notice that the color of the Padauk is not that bright orange that you get when you machine it. With a little bit of finish and a little bit of time, you get a real rich, deep red brown that I love. I think it complements the artwork very nicely. Hey, the next time that you've got something to hang on the wall, why don't you go down to your shop, go through your router bits, find something that's going to make a nice picture frame stock, and make one just like I did today. You know what? Then the frame is going to have a story just like the artwork. If you enjoyed this show today, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Hit the notification bell, and that way you'll know about every one of our videos when we put them out. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.